It's week 13. It's time to talk waivers. It's time to help your fantasy team. It's presented by Snickers. Rookie mistake. Maybe you just need a Snickers. Hopefully don't have a lot of rookies still dealing with their fantasy rosters, as you got to make some moves to get yourself ready for the fantasy playoffs. And Pat Freiermuth coming off a huge game. Roshan Johnson's in a great spot. Got Demario Douglas hopefully playing in week 13. Curtis Samuel's coming off a big game. And Gardner Minshew could have a good game in week 13. 5 free agents that we're looking at here on Fantasy Football Today. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard. Dave, got to help some people with their fantasy teams, and a lot of teams on a bye. Oh my goodness, 6 teams on a bye. It's not fun.
And right when everybody's making that playoff push, and it's a weird year in fantasy where it looks like the AFC wildcard rankings, where you've got one team at the top and then like 7 teams that are within one game of each other. Wild fantasy season. This is not a great time for 6 teams with good fantasy players to all be missing.
Could be a great time, though, if your team is not dealing with any bye week issues, but you could still be adding some players, and we'll start with the tight ends. Not usually the position that we start with, but Pat Freiermuth is the most coveted player based on what we saw in his week 12 performance without Matt Canada. Here are the tight ends on a bye. Some big-time players that you'll be missing, specifically TJ Hawkinson and Dalton Kincaid. So tough to find replacements there, but we'll help you out. Some injuries at the position that we're dealing with as well might be a good situation because Dallas Goedert is hoping to return. He is rostered in 80% of leagues, so for the 20% of leagues where he's still available, go add him because he could be playing in week 13 against the 49ers. And he's really the only one that we have to keep an eye on because everybody else is, for the most part, going to be out in week 13. The tight ends to add, the prize this week at any position is Pat Freiermuth, but Cade Otton, Isaiah Likely, even though he's on a bye, worth picking up. They get 6 targets the first game without Mark Andrews. Tyler Higbee scored 2 touchdowns. Don't know if you want to make him a priority, but Juwan Johnson could be one of the leading receivers for the Saints, and Gerald Everett. It's now 5 of the last 7 games where a Chargers tight end has scored at least 10 PPR points. So they're getting the job done at that position. But Dave, let's talk about Pat Freiermuth because bye-bye Matt Canada, hello, new fantasy option. 11 targets, 120 yards, 9 catches. Is it sustainable?
No, I don't think that's sustainable, but I think him having a significant role in the offense is sustainable. And something else that happened leading up to this game, Freiermuth was practicing on a regular basis. His health was better. Remember, he's been battling injuries all season long. He also went up against one of the easiest matchups in Cincinnati in week number 12. Luckily, he's got another really favorable matchup in week 13 against Arizona. 4 of the last 5 tight ends to play against the Cardinals have scored at least 10 half PPR points. So he's getting good volume. He should get plenty of yards. Maybe he scores a touchdown on top of that. That's part of how Arizona's been dealing with tight ends. Tight ends have been scoring on them. So Freiermuth could find the end zone, could be the only touchdown that they throw in that game.
Yep, as we saw again, Tyler Higbee with 2 touchdowns against the Cardinals last week. So hopefully Freiermuth does find the end zone, but certainly someone you want to add and hopefully can give you the fantasy production that you need. Tight ends that you're moving on from in week 13, the guys that were dropping at this position. Hunter Henry gets a revenge game. I don't care. Had no targets last week. Same thing with Jonnu Smith. No targets last week. And Luke Musgrave, Matt LaFleur said, unfortunately, he's probably not going to play the remainder of the season dealing with that lacerated kidney. So unless you have an IR spot, no need to roster Luke Musgrave. As we transition now to the running backs, a big story that we're looking at now out of Indianapolis is Jonathan Taylor dealing with a thumb injury, and that puts Zach Moss squarely in the minds of fantasy managers once again. He is available in about 25% of leagues, so he is the number 1 player to go add right now because as we saw earlier this season, he was an absolute star whenever there was no Jonathan Taylor. And look, he's coming off a game with 9 PPR points with Taylor. So he is the most coveted player of the guys that are available everywhere if he is available. But we know that we typically talk about guys 65% rostered or less, and he's outside that range. So Zach Moss is available. How much fab are you putting on him?
Well, what do I have left? Because that's the type of player that can change fantasy fortunes if Jonathan Taylor is going to miss the rest of the season. We're not sure how many games
he may not miss
he's
anything,
going to miss. And he might not miss a single game. But certainly if you've got Jonathan Taylor and you don't have Zach Moss, number 1, what are you doing? You need to protect your investment in Jonathan Taylor with a guy who can get it done like Zach Moss. But if that's you've got Taylor, you don't have Moss, Moss is on your waiver wire, go pick him up at any cost possible. And if you need a running back for this week, make the move for Zach Moss, because if he does play, huge opportunity against the Titans defense that's underwhelmed as far as run defense goes this year.
And hopefully we get some answers on Taylor's thumb injury before you have to make your waiver wire moves, whether it's Tuesday night or Wednesday. But it would be nice to get some clarity on what's going on there. Running backs on a bye, again, a lot of stars not there. No Saquon Barkley, no Josh Jacobs. Whew, man, not fun not having those two guys. And the guy that you might want to have now is Roschon Johnson, as we'll show you the players to add at the position. But the injuries that we're dealing with at running back as well. Again, some significant ones. We hope to get Aaron Jones back this week. Maybe Kenneth Walker as well. It would be nice to have those guys back, but clearly A.J. Dillon, Zach Charbonnet going to be heavily involved if those guys in front of them are out. Devon Achane, I don't know if the Dolphins want to risk putting him out there on that field in Washington. I would probably be a little bit cautious. And then Rico Dowdle should be good to go against Seattle, another player that you'd be looking to add off the waiver wire, as you'll see right now with the running backs that you're looking to pick up. Now, Roschon Johnson is my favorite guy. Dave likes Jeff Wilson the best because he's playing this week. But in terms of Roschon, we'll get into him in a second. But you see some of these other players here. We've been talking a little bit about Zach Moss as a handcuff option. You see Rico Dowdle, you see Elijah Mitchell, you see Dearness Johnson. They are the number 2 running backs on some very good offenses. You want to make sure you have those guys, whether you have the player in front of them or not. Those could be lottery ticket type of players, just in case anybody gets hurt in front of them. And then Antonio Gibson and Samaje Perine, good options in PPR based on what we've seen either recently or the majority of the season. But Dave, let's talk about Roschon Johnson because he had his most playing time in the Monday night win against the Vikings. As you see, 10 carries for 35 yards, 5 catches for 40 yards on 5 targets. The 15 touches were impressive. 50 snaps compared to 15 for Khalil Herbert. Is Roschon Johnson now the best running back in Chicago?
I think he is. And I know that the Bears are probably going to use multiple running backs no matter the situation, but it looks like Roschon has leapfrogged Khalil Herbert. And if Deontay Foreman's going to continue to miss time with his injury, then Roschon Johnson after the bye should be the number 1 running back for the Bears. And listen, his efficiency should get a boost when Justin Fields is on the field. We didn't see that against Minnesota. I think that's because the Vikings' run defense is pretty good. I think the Bears' schedule, their next 2 games, kind of tough against Detroit and Cleveland, but after that, the schedule looks really good. If Roschon's the guy, he's another number 2 running back type that you can pick up off the waiver wire. You wait a week for him, and then you go ahead and you potentially start him.
Could be a league winner, so if you don't need someone for this week, he should be a huge priority for you. Jeff Wilson, however, might be more of a priority option if you do need someone for this week as they take on the Commanders. He looked good without Devon Achane, without Savon Ahmed as the number 2 running back behind Raheem Mostert.
10.3 PPR points as the number 2 rusher, like you said, for the Dolphins. And just think about the game script for their matchup against Washington this week. Tua should be able to do whatever he wants in the first half. Mostert will get involved. When this game is a blowout, that's when you figure to see Jeff Wilson, even if Devon Achane is activated. So it makes sense to me that Wilson could be in line for the same type of workload that he just had against the Jets. And the Jets, a much tougher matchup. 14 touches against the Commanders should be good for at least 10 PPR points again. It's not pretty. There isn't a surefire running back other than Zach Moss if there is no Jonathan Taylor to pick up and immediately start. He's the best of what's left. And so warm body, going to carry the football, going to play at least a third of the snaps. That's as good as it gets in Week 13 with so many players on bye.
And look, we've seen this Dolphins offense produce good production from 2 running backs. We know earlier in the season it was Mostert and Achane. Prior to Ahmed getting hurt 2 weeks ago, he scored a touchdown against the Raiders as well through the air. So Wilson, 10 PPR points, something you can hopefully get as a flex option for this week. Running backs that you're looking to move on from. You'll see a couple Bears on this list again going into their bye week with Khalil Herbert and Deontay Foreman. No real reason to roster those 2 guys, especially if you can drop them for Roschon Johnson. Dameon Pierce, we know Devin Singletary has been awesome, and Pierce probably not going to get the job back unless there's an injury. Jaleel McLaughlin's now 3rd on the Broncos depth chart, and Darrell Henderson remains on the practice squad for the Rams. Wide receivers that we're looking at here, and again, big list of players on a bye. So again, you see some of the stars that you're not going to have. No Stephon Diggs, no DJ Moore, no Devontae Adams. Hopefully Justin Jefferson after the bye, that would be fun. And you see there for the Giants, Jalen Hyatt, but he is somebody that you could be adding off the waiver wire because he's coming off a 100-yard game. Injuries at the position, again, not exactly a lot of guys that we were expecting to be out, but we are keeping an eye on Chris Olave with a concussion. Really hope he's back with a good matchup against Detroit. We hope to get Amari Cooper back out there, maybe with a new quarterback, especially if there is Joe Flacco starting for the Browns. I know that sounds weird to say, but Flacco would be an upgrade over DTR and PJ Walker. T. Higgins will hopefully return this week as well, dealing with a hamstring injury. And then we'll see what happens with Michael Wilson because that impacts one of the guys that we're going to show you on the players to add at wide receiver with Greg Dortch, who's been very good going back to last season. Every time he's gotten at least 4 targets. So hopefully that will be the case. He's got 17 targets in his last 2 games without Michael Wilson. A couple of these guys are more long-term plays. You know, A.T. Perry's interesting this week because of the injuries at the wide receiver position for New Orleans. Odell Beckham's on a bye, but you want to pick him up and carry him because he's going to be heavily involved in the Ravens offense. And then the 2 guys at the top, we got one that may not play in Demario Douglas and one that could be impactful but has been inconsistent, Curtis Samuel. But Dave, let's start with Demario Douglas because dealing with a head injury, not exactly listed as a concussion, but that's probably what the case is. We'll find out he's in the concussion protocol. If he plays this week against the Chargers, would you start him? And if he's out, how much do you want to roster him for the rest of the season?
He would be a wide receiver 3 for me if he were to play, and that's in full PPR. He's had at least 10 PPR points in 3 straight games. I know that this Patriots offense is a mess outside of Ramondre Stevenson, but he's the next best guy that would be there, a short area target for whoever the quarterback is for the Patriots. He would be my favorite guy to add if you're thinking long term, because I think even if he misses this week, there are going to be several weeks ahead where you'll get double-digit PPR points, the type of wide receiver you'd like to have on your bench, preferably not in your lineup, outside of this week if he does actually play.
Back-to-back games with 9 targets, back-to-back games with 6 catches, and 38 targets in his last 5 games. So Douglas has emerged as the #1 receiver for the Patriots. If he's out, deeper leagues look at Devontae Parker, who would probably be the best receiving option for the Patriots. You got to be desperate to trust Devontae Parker. Curtis Samuel's coming off a huge game, actually his best game of the season, 19 PPR points in the Thanksgiving Day loss against the Cowboys, and again taking on the Dolphins. Is this someone that you can say consistent, because we just haven't seen consistency from him all season long?
You cannot say consistent unless it's in a bad way, because he had under 7 PPR points in 4 of his prior 5 games.
One of those he got ejected, though.
Yeah, it still stinks. And I don't know if fantasy managers really want to trust that, but going back to the game script for the Dolphins and the Commanders, look, if the Dolphins are going to put up points and Washington's got to throw from behind, and if Washington can't run the ball on the Dolphins, well, Curtis Samuel is the change up there. So a lot of short area targets. He gets a couple of deep ones as well. I don't mind him this week. And if you want to make sure you lock in a wide receiver who will play, and you're worried about Demario Douglas, Samuel's the one that I would go after. It's not pretty, but he might be able to get you 10, 12 PPR points.
He's got 4 games this season with at least 7 targets, 3 of them 18 PPR points or more. And you mentioned them throwing. Well, Sam Howell's thrown the ball 42 times in 6 straight games, 42 times or more in 6 straight games. So probably throwing quite a bit. Wide receivers that you're moving on from, Jerry Jeudy's got a season high this season of 13 PPR points. That was the only game he scored a touchdown. And it's not been pretty for him lately. So Jerry Jeudy you can move on from. Tyler Boyd, we know without Joe Burrow, hard to trust him. And then Rashid Shaheed, probably going to miss this week's game against the Lions, which is his best matchup coming up. I don't know if you want to roster Shaheed anytime soon if he's not going to play this week. All right, let's go now from the wide receivers to the quarterbacks, and here are the guys that are on a bye for this week. Again, a lot of big-time stars that are missing. Lamar Jackson out, Josh Allen out, Justin Fields out. Joshua Dobbs, does he still qualify as a star? But he's out, and then Aiden O'Connell and Tommy DeVito as well, not going to play because they're on a bye. The injuries at the position, really the one that we're keeping an eye on is Baker Mayfield, because he's been a serviceable fantasy quarterback dealing with that ankle injury. Hopefully he'll be good to go. And then DTR in the concussion protocol. We don't know who's going to start for the Browns if Dorian Thompson-Robinson can't go, but we're hopeful that it could be Joe Flacco just for what he can do for the wide receivers. Players to add at the quarterback position, again, not the prettiest of options for this week because most of the good quarterbacks are already rostered, but Gardner Minshew, good matchup against the Titans. Kenny Pickett, can he build off last week's game against the Cardinals in a good matchup? And then again, Joe Flacco, this is more super flex in 2 quarterback leagues. But Dave, let's talk about Minshew, because 4 straight games under 18 fantasy points or less, had just under 15 fantasy points last week in a great matchup against Tampa Bay. Can you trust him against the Titans if you are desperate, again, with all those quarterbacks who are missing?
What did I say on our podcast today? He's a warm body with a pulse who throws a football for a living, and therefore he qualifies to be a potential bye week replacement. He's the best of the bunch. There's no question the matchup against Tennessee dictates it. And we know that he runs a little bit. He could always run for a touchdown, throw for a touchdown. And if there's no Jonathan Taylor, doesn't that change the offense a little bit for Indianapolis? So, yeah, I'm kind of encouraged by what Gardner Minshew can be. He might even sneak into the top 12 this week as far as fantasy QBs go. My favorite add of the bunch, but really every quarterback that we're talking about adding and using this week, some of them have high upside. All of them have a terrible floor of single-digit fantasy points. You don't want that from your quarterback. At least Minshew should get you 10 fantasy points. That's rough for a quarterback. But he should be able to do better than that.
I'll take the over. The Titans allow 18 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks for the season. If he hits 18 points, that might put him close to the top 5, but it's probably going to get him into the top 10. And I think he will get to 18 fantasy points with or without Jonathan Taylor. We hope with, because that's a much better situation. The quarterback you're moving on from is Geno Smith. He has 2 games this season over 17 fantasy points. And good luck taking on the Cowboys in Dallas. And then you come back with a rematch against San Francisco in Week 14. Bye-bye Geno in 1 quarterback leagues. Make sure you check out the Fantasy Football Today podcast wherever podcasts are found. Also check out the Fantasy Football Today Dynasty podcast. We are helping you win your fantasy leagues one day at a time because we broadcast daily. The Fantasy Football Today podcast, the best podcast in the business.